Hi, my name is Alex, and today we're going to talk about why the news is so stressful, what to do about it, and what scenario overload has to do with all that, and why scenario exploder. So the problem is that we have too many scenarios to contend with. In a normal situation, you would have specific problems that you're trying to solve. Maybe it's what you're going to do for work, what school should you go to, where should you live, that kind of stuff. And then you would deal with that in the context of scenario planning. So you might say, hey, I think I want to be a computer science person, so I'm going to go to school for that. Or you might say, I want to move to another town because I think the economy might be better. The problem is that if you get too many problems, especially in the news nowadays, you've got this combinatorial explosion problem. Basically, you're trying to sort out how to deal with all these rapid changes in technology and politics and geopolitics and all of these pieces, and then how do you layer them together? That in turn leads to cognitive overload and loops, because you might say, well, I want to change professions, but I don't even know what to change to because everything's going to fall apart. Or you might say, I want to move, but I don't even know if I'm going to make things better when I move. So you start looping and your brain starts just getting too stressed out. And then that makes it harder to plan, because the more stressed out you are, the harder it is to plan. And then that in turn makes things more stressful because now you can't even plan. So the number of scenarios that we're dealing with, this is a real quick summary view, but I think it'll get a sense of the problem. So first off, we've got the end of oil. So even the oil producing countries are talking in their reports about how oil is going to fade away as a strategic resource. We also have the end of globalization, in part because of the end of oil. We have institutional collapse. Everything that we put in place between World War II and the Cold War now is ancient history. So if you're, say, 30 years old, none of that stuff resonates with you anymore. You've got the rise of fascism, which is kind of committed to two things. One, institutional destruction, so all of the order that was set up after World War II and the Cold War. And that's also a big component in the culture wars that we're dealing with right now. You have the rise of AI and LLMs, which is today affecting white-collar jobs, and we know that robotics are coming. That, in turn, means that we may see AI affecting blue-collar jobs. We also see that being a big factor in the rise of drones as a new form of military technology. On top of that, we have the U.S. withdrawing as an international player for a variety of reasons. And that in turn also means that we're seeing the rise of regional wars where the U.S. is no longer acting as a guarantor for protection. So that could be Ukraine and Russia, it could be Israel and Gaza, China, Taiwan, India and Pakistan. And all of these things include the possibility of escalation ladders that could make things even more dangerous. So considering all of these things we just talked about, you can understand where it would be almost impossible to plan for anything. There are too many scenarios to deal with. You don't know if you should say, for example, what you should study in school. You don't know what you should do if you lose your job. You don't know where you should live, because all of these things affect all of this stuff. So that in turn becomes this question of how do you deal with and manage all this overload? So I have a few points. One of them is simplifying the scenarios down to identify what the root causes are, getting really clear about what you have control over and what you don't have control over, and then using that clarity to help focus and plan on what you're going to do. All right, so let's talk about some of the concrete steps. Now, the first and most obvious one is what you're kind of doing now, even by watching this video, and that's doing your research. One of the things that you'll learn when you start looking through history is that everything we're talking about right now we've gone through way worse in history in the past. It makes it tricky because when you read history or you watch a movie about history or something, there's a certain level of distance. But things land differently today because now we're dealing with those things happening to us. So probably the most vivid example is the rise of fascism. Fascism is not new. We've experienced fascism and world wars and all of the challenges in the past, but now it's coming home to us. Now we have to deal with it. Maybe you have been living in some place where you've been dealing with this for some time, or maybe this is new for you, but you're going to find a lot of material in history. You're also going to find information in contemporary data as well. So that can help you get some perspective about what's going on right now. The next point is talk to other folks. And I also really recommend one-on-one or small groups for this stuff. We can often rely a lot on going online to have these conversations, but when you're talking with your friends and your family about what's going on in the world today, that conversation is key to feeling connected and trying to figure out what to do with things. And then the other one is remember who you are. And what I mean by that is things as they're shifting and they're murky, it is worth taking the time, and I maybe even just open up either an actual journal or a notes on your computer, whatever works best for you, and take a little time and write down what's important to you. Those things become what drives your goals, and that's what drives how you plan and think about the future. So that also means double checking to make sure that your actions are in line with who you are. So you might think of yourself as someone who's very calm and level-headed, but if you find yourself doing things like wasting your time engaging in online raging with, for all we know, might even be a bot, right? Is that inconsistent with your values and who you are? The next piece on there is to think about things when you're doing your planning in what I think of as dual use actions. So by way of example, let's say that you're thinking you might want to move, and part of what's driving that desire to move is thinking about all these stressors in the world today, all the geopolitics. The thing is that you can sort of fall into this doom loop of thinking about it. But the best way to actually approach this is to start by just even thinking in terms of, well, before I can move to that place, let's even try to go there for vacation. So if you want to move overseas, it's vastly easier to get a visa just to go visit, even for a couple weeks or a week, than it is to try to actually go through the process of becoming a citizen or getting a long-term visa or a work visa. And so before you even think about going through that process, make sure that you're going to take the time to actually just go for a week and check it out, or 2 or 6 weeks. A lot of places, they even have up to 6 months. So if you have, for example, the option or the capacity to take off the time from work or what have you, go check it out, right? And so what you can do is you can take something that's pretty stressful and make it a little bit more manageable and palatable and less stressful. And when you do that vacation, you actually can both save money by not hitting the tourist spots, but just try to figure out what it's like to live in that place. And that's an example of, it's a dual use thing. It's not just I'm going on the vacation, it's also going to contemplate maybe moving there, and then you get to kind of really think about it. And you'll notice even in a couple of weeks, especially if you avoid the tourist spots, what is life actually like? You're going to want to take your time to talk to the locals and see what that's like in the culture. Same thing with job transitions. Maybe you're worried about your job at work. Maybe you don't know if you're going to have a job. Maybe you don't know if you're going to stay in that career. So what you're going to want to do is, as soon as you can, start networking. And so that might mean going out for coffees and lunches and getting to meet recruiters or whatever it is. And that can be fun. That's part of the whole point. It's not just, networking just because you're worried about your career. It's also networking for career growth and personal growth. And one of the metaphors that I think about that is, over time, we see a lot of people who get into apocalyptic thinking. And one of the most famous example of that was people in the 50s who would build nuclear bomb bunkers in the back of their house or something, right? And those bunkers are often represented a big waste of time and money, but you maybe still want to be able to do preparing. And so for that, you might want to consider something that looks more like camping supplies. A lot of the emergency preparedness folks talk about how you should be sure that you can go for at least 3 days and ideally a week or 2 on your own in the case of a natural emergency, or some sort of natural disaster, for example. By putting the focus on the camping supplies, that means that you're both putting your money and your time and your resources into something that you could use for fun, if you like camping. And it's also a lot cheaper and a lot more reasonable. So think about how to strategize and put your material together in that format. The next part is just keeping sharp and keeping lucid about this stuff. It's very easy to fall into a wave of emotion about all this stuff. One of the things that I would recommend, just for starters, is keep asking what if. Like anytime you get to the point where you're just sort of settled, like these guys are bad because they watch the wrong kind of media. Well, is that really what's going on? Or is there more to it? So you keep asking what if, what if, what if. There's an old saying about kids, that's part of what makes kids' minds flexible is that they don't know, so they can keep asking what if. The other one is avoiding broken logic loops. And this is kind of related. So let me give you an example of a logic loop. So you might read all the news and you conclude that collapse is inevitable. So in that scenario, you might just say, I'm just going to give up. Except life goes on. People still get up, they go to work, they buy their groceries, they do their things. You have family and friends and all this stuff. Anytime you find yourself in a place that says, this is it, this is the end, it's hopeless, what have you, odds are good. That's actually a really good sign that you've got some sort of broken logic loop underlying that thought process, and that's what you're going to want to break out of. Which brings us to Scenario Exploder. So what is Scenario Exploder? At the most basic level, it's all about playing what-if games. So let's say that you are contemplating the outcome of AI and jobs. And so then what you want to do is you don't just simply want to get to the point where you say, well, AI is going to come, it's going to wipe out all the jobs, the end. That's not the end. There will be more things that happen after that. And that what if is exploring it, saying, okay, well, let's take that scenario and let's come up with all the different ways this might come out and do it in a slightly more structured way. So in this case, for Scenario Exploder, what we're going to do is follow a format. We're going to start with a scenario video. In each video, I'm going to go ahead and present a scenario. And a lot of those scenarios are going to be inspired by some of the things that we were talking about earlier in the video, all the different crazy things that are going on in the world today. The video will explain the scenario, break down some of the causes, what's going to happen, some of the likely outcomes from that, and just sort of explore what if. Then at the end of each video, once it's posted, then people will be able to provide feedback. It could be comments, it could be popping on the Discord, what have you. And I'm going to pull all that material together and try to do a second video that collects all that information about what people are thinking. Some of it's going to be a mood check, some of it's going to be aspects that I didn't think of. You know, I'm not an expert in everything in the world, and so often there'll be people who will chime in with really good information about explaining how something's likely to unfold. Then we'll put a new video up, sort of summarizing all that feedback, and then also looking at what the next scenario is going to be. So here are some example scenarios. What if AI actually wipes out all the white-collar jobs? What does that mean? What's that going to do to real estate? What's that going to do to unemployment and how our government puts things together, the economics? Another example, what happens if oil demand collapses? Well, it turns out large chunks of, for example, the U.S. rely on oil and petroleum products for their economics. So what happens to them? What happens if people stop buying gas cars? What happens if there's a rise in climate catastrophes? And we might take a look at specific examples from books. So one example that might be a specific book that outlines a climate catastrophe, and we evaluate that book for the context and see whether or not that provides a good scenario. Another example, what happens if the U.S. federal government were to simply fall apart or just become much more marginalized or discredited? That's something that we're watching, how the federal government is changing today, and is it going to maintain credibility? Is it going to be able to manage its budget? Those are pretty hot questions right now. Now, the whole point of this is actually to decrease stress, not add to stress. Part of the principle there is if you have some idea what might happen after that thing happens, then the planning will actually make things less stressful. So by way of example, let's take AI and white-collar jobs. If we know that white-collar jobs are going to be heavily impacted, that might mean that as an interim thing, you might think about changing how you plan your career. And remember, this too shall pass. And what that phrase means is that no matter what these stressors are that are going on right now, things will continue to evolve and change. One of the things I've found very fascinating is how much people fall into this pattern of apocalyptic thinking. And I think part of the reason for that is it kind of gives people an out. Like if I think that the world is going to fall apart, then that takes the burden off of me for planning for the future. But if I'm going to survive, if my family's going to survive, then that means I'm going to have to contend with these scenarios. That really does highlight the future is not written yet. Part of the point of scenarios and what makes them complicated and interesting is that there are so many potential outcomes. If you took somebody in 1925 and tried to explain to them what the next 25 years were going to look like, everything from the Great Depression and the way the U.S. federal government was going to change and World War II and nuclear bombs and computers and on and on and on, it would be impossible. There are points in that period that would have looked incredibly dark. But the thing is that we got through it and we changed it and things look different. They got better in a lot of ways. Some things maybe got worse. And part of it is we found new problems. We found new things to worry about that we didn't even think of were problems before because we were dealing with a different set of issues. So the future is unwritten and it's going to fall on us, all of us humans, to figure that out. So for the next steps, obviously all the basics, subscribe, watch the videos, comment, and thank you for your time. And the last thing, thanks for watching this video. I want to go ahead and just as a quick point, plug two last things. One of them is please go to the scenarioexploder.com website. There you can sign up for the newsletter and get information about new videos when they go out, and also when things are going to be open for comment, all that fun stuff there. So that's the most reliable way to do it. YouTube may or may not even send out notifications for when there are new updates available. So do go to scenarioexploder.com and sign up to get notifications. The other one is I do have books available on Amazon. So one of the scenarios that I've been thinking about a lot over the last 8 years or so is what happens if the federal government were going to fall apart and how that might look. So I did a book called The Defederalized Democrat, and that's really just talking about how Democrats have lost so much power at the federal level. What does that mean? How are they going to approach things going forward? Do they focus on states, what have you? So even though it says The Defederalized Democrat, the book is, I think, interesting to anybody. So give it a shot. Check it out. Thanks again for watching. Take care and hope to talk to you soon. Bye.